I think I have it now. Okay, that's better. Can you hear me now, folks? Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. I had settings mess up there. We had a one-way introduction from Anya. I'll just quickly start over. Welcome, Anya Combs from Kickstarter. Thank you for joining us for the Imirt Inspire interview. I asked what got you into games, and you were talking about how you got started. So we'll keep going there.
We'll just take it from there. Yeah. So I was working in music. I studied music in college. It's what I thought I would be doing, and I actually still do on the side. Um, and I sort of quickly realized that I did not want to work in the music industry. It just was not for me. It was a very volatile industry. So I applied for this job be a developer relations person for addictinggames.com. And I was like, that's
And
super interesting.
they were Flash Games portal at the time.
Correct, Flash Game Portal, and it essentially was billed as like an AR for Flash games and ANR for artist relations. So basically, like
So that's
uh,
a music management term,
music.
essentially. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was basically like a licensing job for Flash games. And I was like, that's super weird. I mean, I jewels and like these like fun little sort of like shockwave games. But the Flash world was like I was pretty new to the whole space, and I ended up getting the job and sort of fell in love with the industry. And I've let's see, next year will be 10 years in the games industry for me, which is pretty cool.
So that was around 2008.
2008, yeah.
Yeah. So at that exact time, I was just starting to try and make games, and Flash games were the kind of they were blowing up, and there was suddenly money in them, and that's exactly what you were working at, licensing Flash games from third parties. So it'd been there were lots of nice things about Flash games. So they were immediately playable and small, and you could self-publish. And suddenly there was a way to kind of make money off traffic by essentially licensing your game to portals, which Addicting Games was one of. So you wanted to get an audience, and small game makers wanted to get paid for their games somehow.
Mhm.
And so was that essentially your job, finding cool games or working with people?
Yeah, it was a combination of a lot of things. I mean, my main responsibility was finding really awesome Flash games from indie creators. People were as young as like 13 years old that we were working with, and as old as, I mean, not old, but as old as I am now at about 30, 34 years old. I guess like we're old in the industry now, which is
Yeah.
sort of like bananas to think about. So I used a website called flashgamelicense.com, fgl.com. They were essentially like the in-between partners between how do you get a hold of a lot of these Flash game developers. They would put their games up. It was sort of like an auction site, which was really cool. And then you would build relationships from there. And so people would email us directly, specifically me directly, and say like, hey, I have a cool Flash game. Or we would say, hey, we have an idea for a Flash game. We want to get an exclusive license, or we want you to build this project for us.
So
So
how would that work? Would you approach people that you'd worked with before, or put it up on FGL saying we're looking for someone to do X?
no, we would pretty much reach out to people directly. People also had their own sort of ideas that they would pitch to us and say, hey, we want you to be the essentially like the publisher of this game. Publishing was a little bit different in Flash than it is in the sort of, PC console space, and even the mobile space as a mobile publisher. I think mobile publishing is a little bit closer to what Flash game publishing was, and we would never call ourselves a publisher. That was still very much like, you know,
Yeah,
someone
scary. Yeah.
lists. Don't say that. So, so we would say licensor more than anything else. So it was a lot of back and forth between creators. And the cool thing is now, transitioning over to Kickstarter, and I've been in Kickstarter about a year and a half now. A lot of these old contacts that I've had in the Flash game space, and I was in Flash for, I want to say like 6 or 7 years, I believe. A number of those creators are now coming to Kickstarter to kickstart their projects that were initially Flash games,
Bigger
or
projects. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So it's really fun to kind of see the transition from Flash into PC console and mobile, and just kind of how it's sort of interchangeable. Of like, if you have a cool idea, Flash was a great space to kind of test that idea.
Yes, yeah. There was a
Make
lot
it.
of there were a lot of Flash games that then went on to become, fully published bigger games.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
was kind of like a little kind of test space for smaller
yeah.
projects. Yeah.
It was
Uh,
like an internet incubator. Yeah.
and the way like addicting games worked, you mentioned before you weren't a publisher, you're more like it was kind of set up to be licensed, which means you'd pay for use of it or exclusive use of it, but it didn't it generally meant you didn't own the IP and people could go on and make bigger follow-on games if there was success. Which is kind of
Right.
an interesting model, kind of a developer-friendly model. I mean, do you think
Yeah.
that's because FGL were the people who kind of um, kind of kind of set that structure? I remember they came up with a kind of a default template for licensing, non-exclusive licensing, which a lot of
Yeah.
people used.
Yeah. I think FGL really were literal game changers in the Flash game space. They came up with they also came up with a license called a primary license. So we would be
Yeah,
like
that's the
primary
one.
licensor. There was a non-exclusive, exclusive. There was also, from time to time, we would buy IP just because it was, oh, we understand this IP is so important. This is so interesting, and we want to be able to, hold on to it as much as we possibly can. Those deals were much more rare, but they did happen from time to time, and it always was sort of an interesting, like, contentious point with creators because what are you told as an independent creator? Like, never sell
Never
your IP.
giving up.
Yeah, and so those deals were always a little bit more challenging.
And particularly because in Flash it was generally more amateur creators. So I was talking to a really well respected creator recently about that notion of giving up your IP to a publisher, and they said, "Oh, I create IP all the time," which is really interesting to me. Well, I'm still in that feeling where I'm like, "Oh, it's the most precious thing I can make,"
Yeah,
but the truth is, you do make a lot of it, and you're always full of ideas making new things.
right. I mean, I think you have to kind of pick your battles in that sense. Like, if it's something where you're like, this is my baby, this is the thing that I care deeply for, then I don't, I would never encourage anyone to like give that up. But if you sort of understand, like, this is something where I'm not necessarily super tied to it, and I think it's a cool idea, but I'm interested to explore what other people could do with it too. Like, that's totally fine to kind of like negotiate some sort of IP deal.
So, um, around 2008, it was really booming in those next couple of years, and then I think mobile kind of killed Flash off. So, gaming and mobile became very viable, and
Mhm.
then kind of boomed, but then changed how games work. So, if I made a small throwaway game, smallish in content game in Flash, I could sell a primary license to someone like Addicting Games and move on. In mobile, it's certainly become the case now that if you make a game like that, no one will play it, and it's kind of there's kind of no way to make that small piece of money that used to be in licensing,
Mhm.
and I think that's kind of stomped all over Flash as well or that whole kind of structure of creators that was really interesting at the time.
Mhm. 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 Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think with Flash, it was sort of like a good test bed. And with mobile, I mean, mobile didn't support Flash. And I think uh, there was a lot of interesting discussions about HTML5, and HTML5 became this sort of like was gonna solve all of the issues with Flash, and it was this sort of constant like, is Flash dead? Flash is dead. Okay, well,
Flash is dead
HTML5.
every year apparently. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much of it depends on who you ask, right? Hacks also was a huge programming language that was going to fix all of our issues because it's a cross-platform way to build games. I I I don't know. I mean, I kind of think if there's more ways to build a game, it just means that we're going to get better games, right? Like, I don't think Flash is easy, right? Like, so like AS3, like coding in AS3, from what I understand, I do not have a coding background. I totally goes over my head. From what I understand, it was pretty simplistic,
Yeah.
um, pretty straightforward. So I think that's a good starting point for people. But if when you sort of introduce all these different ways to build games, like I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I understand being tied. I mean, look, if people in the games industry, we don't like change. We will fight it as much as we possibly can. But I think that the more opportunity that you're building within the industry, the more sort of like invention and creativity just kind of goes into it. Mobile is sort of a really interesting space because it grew so quickly, and there's so many people that kind of have that also say like mobile's dead. I don't know if that's necessarily the case. And I also think like I think it was Tuesday was the Apple conference, like Monument Valley 2 just launched
Just
and people
released, yeah.
losing their minds over it. So I think it just takes a specific mobile game to really like kind of hit the market. But I think mobile is also, I think just like the use of a mobile device is changing quickly because I don't, so much of it is generational too, but like I used to just play tons and tons and tons of mobile games and I still play a good number of mobile games. But I use this more as sort of like a social networking
Yeah,
device
sure.
else, just because it's like it's a drop in drop out. And with a mobile game sometimes it's like okay great, match 3 games, you can jump in, play a couple minutes, whatever, no big deal. But if I just kind of scroll through Twitter and be like, oh, what is my idiot president doing now? It's a little bit easier for me to just like in terms of time usage, it's just a little bit more simplistic. So I think the attitudes about mobile are changing just based on our attention span is shortening as the years progress too.
I heard something about Twitter, which is interesting, was that it wasn't competing with other messaging apps. It's not about messaging.
Yeah.
It's competing with free time. So like I have 2 minutes while I'm waiting here for my coffee. I'll spend
Yeah.
those 2 minutes just looking at things very briefly. So it's a
Yeah.
whole different like concept. And it's kind of the same with mobile games where you kind of, the really successful ones are played in kind of bite-sized chunks.
Exactly.
It's a whole
Exactly. Yeah.
different idea. Yeah.
Yeah. 100%. I completely agree.
I want to come back to mobile when we start talking about Kickstarter because
Yeah.
there's this to me a huge gap there. Um,
Mhm.
but you moved on to Nickelodeon, who are obviously a TV network, but
Mhm.
also big into games. And your job there was games, right? Was
Correct.
game specific, and again, kind of developer relations. Like, what? So, what did you do in Nickelodeon? Was it pretty much what you'd done before?
Yeah, so I started at Addicting Games in 2008, and I believe AG was under the Adam Entertainment umbrella, and I think it was either in 2006 or 2007. Viacom, which is the parent company of Nickelodeon, purchased Adam Entertainment, which means that they bought game trailers, addictinggames.com, shockwave.com. I think there might have been like one other two smaller companies. I'm not 100% sure. There was company acquisitions at that level are always like very
Yeah,
confusing.
it's funny when you're so big, you're not even sure which companies are
Yeah,
included.
it was extremely confusing. I was like, who do I work for? What is this? So it was a little bit challenging. Because we also were like, I think we were like MTV Networks at that point, but then Nickelodeon was part of MTV Networks, and so I was like, do I work for MTV? Like, I don't understand what's happening. So it was super confusing, and I was like, I work for addictinggames.com. Like, I don't care what the branding is. This is what I was hired to do. So I will just say that I work for addictinggames.com. Like, cool, work, no worries. Um, so so Nickelodeon was rolled under, or Addicting Games was rolled under the Nickelodeon umbrella. And as the years sort of went on, the Nickelodeon branding took over more and more and more. Some executive at the Viacom branch sort of saw that this like weird little flash game site was really, really popular for the demographic of
Yeah,
sort of looking for. And then as U.S. law sort of started to get a little bit more tightened around what you could do with kids content for a multitude of different reasons. Mostly like the internet wasn't as much of a wild west as it kind of was in 2006, 2007, 2008. The Nickelodeon brand really started to take over the Addicting Games brand. So I was still doing a lot of developer. I mean, I've always been a
did that
developer.
did that change the focus of what the kind of games and you were commissioning? They're much
Absolutely.
more on brand for Nickelodeon.
Yeah, the rules of like what type of gore you could show, things as like headshots for some of the like sniper games, and then also just sniper games in general.
I was about to say, yeah.
The site really sort of tended to get scrubbed. We also were a little bit more involved with some of the Nickelodeon IP. So like I vividly remember having to have discussions about like what the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles could and couldn't do. Those were always really interesting and fun. And when some of the new IP came in for some of the new shows on Nickelodeon, we were sort of privy to kind of like what those shows were, how were we involved in them.
So you would hire people to create games around the IP, or
Yeah, we were definitely involved in some of that. The structure of it was a little bit confusing because there were a lot of moving parts. That is definitely one of the things that I love about Kickstarter the most in terms of the comparison is like I'm now on a team of two, three with a consultant that we have in Germany. But there's two of us that are full-time dedicated to Kickstarter just games. And at Nick and AG, at any time it could be as much as like 30 people and as little as 10. So it would be a little bit confusing as
yeah,
to kind of how many people need to be involved in the mix. I think when you have 30 people deciding on one, 20-minute game, there's a lot of moving parts and personalities that are involved
and
in
a
it. So
lot of back and forth and
yeah,
time. Yeah,
and this person and that person, and it's just that's from what I've seen, that's just kind of the corporate structure, which like doesn't really work for everyone. And for some people, it works great and they love it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I sort of quickly realized, like, oh, I don't want to have 20 different people approving something that should be instantaneous. So it's sort of interesting. So the IP stuff was always really, really fascinating. So in I believe it would have been 2013, 2014. Addicting Games was then sold from underneath the Nickelodeon umbrella to Defy Media. So I was moved over to a sort of new team that was formed at Nickelodeon called the Content Development Team, where my focus was purely on content development and developer relations for mobile games.
so
Every once in a
okay, yeah.
while,
So at
yeah,
that
so
point, mobile games, that was the thing. That
right.
transition had happened. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would look at a lot of, so we would send out, RFPs and then get proposals back. And so it was a lot of printing things out and looking at different proposals and lots of back and forth. And it was definitely like,
So would you say Nickelodeon at that point you were acting more like a publisher?
yeah, I would.
Yeah.
Again, you'll never hear anyone say that, but yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So now you work for Kickstarter as games outreach, right?
Yes.
So I want to talk about this a lot because obviously Kickstarter is a huge thing for creators, a massive game changer. It's been huge for games and huge for board games as well. Like digital and board games are two huge sectors. Are you in charge of both of them, or is board game team different?
Well, so there's only two of us that are full time. Again, third with a German consultant. And my main focus is definitely video games, or digital games. Board games, I'll do like a couple if the projects come in that like maybe I have a relationship with that creator or like, oh, this is really interesting. But the other half of the games team, Luke, he is himself a tabletop games creator, so he's very, very deep into that world.
Sure.
He's much more familiar with sort of like the shipping woes of shipping physical games. So I'd say for me it's like a 90-10 split, 90% digital, 10% board game.
Sure. So Kickstarter has had a really interesting kind of impact on games. When it first started, I remember there were, we were amazed that, games were getting, $20,000, and then Double Fine blew that out of the water with the Broken Age documentary. And then since then, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger in terms of games. Why do you think that is? Why do you think, like, what's different there?
Well, I think there's a couple of different reasons. I mean, one, you're basically saying you're not necessarily removing the publisher, right? But you are saying, hey, this is my idea. I'm very excited about this idea. I've put all of this work into this idea. Do you want to participate in this with me? We've seen that, like, despite the internet being the internet and like people just like to be mean on the internet sometimes,
Sometimes.
regardless of all of that, people genuinely just kind of want you to succeed. Kickstarter is a really interesting space in terms of when you're running a project, what you're really doing more than anything is you're a community builder. You're building a community. You're participating in a community, and you're saying, hey, community, I have this cool idea. Do you want to do this with me? So you're sort of asking your friends, your family, and your fans, and maybe, people you don't even know, do you want to help me build this project? Do you want to be a part of it? So when a game comes out and you've backed that project, you can say, hey, I participated in that. I was a part of this process. I am a part of this game in sort of a roundabout way. And that's really powerful from a fan perspective.
I think so too, and I think that's why Kickstarter blew up, because suddenly you were empowering people whose projects wouldn't happen otherwise. You felt like you were part of the process. It was really exciting. But since then, I feel Kickstarter has become much more of a business, and people using Kickstarter for games. It's become less about that interesting project that wouldn't happen without Kickstarter, and instead more kind of a platform for finding and funding games projects in particular. Maybe we can talk about that a bit. I mean, how do you Kickstarter view games projects that you feature? What do you like to see?
Yeah, well, I actually don't agree that it's become more of a business. I think the thing about Kickstarter is that there's definitely been a large number of high-profile projects. And with those high profile projects, a lot of times what comes with that is a lot of press and recognition, right? The other side of that doesn't get talked about a lot is that Kickstarter is really a hotbed for indie projects. This year alone, projects like Thimbleweed Park, Hyperlight Drifter, I think Hyperlight Drifter actually may have launched last year. I always get some of those confused. Super Hot, That Dragon Cancer, which I believe also came out last year, which is, not only an indie darling, but just like a heartbreaking sort of discussion. Undertale, which again is a really fantastic project, great indie project of like a single developer who's done everything. Pinstripe, which came out this year, which is also a solo developer who's done everything by himself. These are people that have really built, again, a community around their project and around their idea. There definitely are publishers that will look at Kickstarter and say, hey, we're kind of looking around, we're poking around, seeing what's going on here. I think, again, like kind of similar to like Flash versus HTML5 versus hacks, like the more opportunity that we're sort of building within the games industry, I just think the more opportunity there is for games. So I don't think that Kickstarter is necessarily like one specific thing. I think the bulk of it is indie projects that wouldn't necessarily have been seen otherwise.
That's very true.
Yeah, Kickstarter really does give people the opportunity to say, like, if a creator says like, hey, I'm on Kickstarter, people are kind of going to listen to that, even if people are like, oh, I'm done with Kickstarter, which like that's totally fair. They're still going to know what Kickstarter is, and they're going to have some of those recognitions of like, oh, well, there's XYZ projects were either funded or didn't fund on Kickstarter. So there's a recognition that's involved in that.
You're right. It is easy to focus on the kind of the very biggest projects that are more commercially or publisher led. But yeah, every game you just reeled off there, they are really good examples of games that do Kickstarter well and are more personal projects that are happening thanks to Kickstarter.
Yeah, that's where we excel, really.
So what is your job essentially in Kickstarter? Do you find games projects, or do you help feature them? Do you help game developers with their Kickstarter?
It's sort of a combination of all of it. So games outreach is basically if you want to run a Kickstarter project specifically for video games, and you have questions and you want someone to sort of guide you through that process, I am your person to talk to. So at any given point, I can be working on 10 to 20 different projects, which is sometimes a lot of work and also like super awesome and exciting, because at the end of the day, like my dream when I was studying music in college is I wanted to shape musicians' careers. I wanted to participate in that process. And so now I kind of realized from a music standpoint, I actually want to be a musician. I want to play music, and I play music here in New York, which is great. And so I'm fulfilling that sort of dream of my own. And at Kickstarter, I get to kind of participate in like helping a creator with their dream project, which is fantastic and sometimes a little nerve-wracking, but also like very exciting and fun. So I do a lot of back and forth with creators. I'll work with them on their project as soon as they're like, we're thinking of doing a Kickstarter project. I would
And
like some.
how does that come into you? Do people just email you saying, I have this game and I'm going to put it on Kickstarter, advice?
Yeah, basically you can email me directly. I can give you my email at the end. But people email me directly. I do a lot of my own sort of like weird internet sleuthing. And I'll reach out to people directly.
You just turn up at people's house offering Kickstarter.
Pretty much, just knock on the we were making a game. It is really interesting. I'll email people, and it doesn't happen super often, but it happens enough that it's worth mentioning. I'll have people say, wait, I don't understand. Someone works at Kickstarter. So we've really spent the last year and a half trying to sort of like make ourselves be known a little bit more. Before I started, it was just one person running all of games, which is absolutely mind-boggling to me. That includes like the very prolific tabletop space and the video game space, which is just like, I don't know how he was doing it. So having two people, we're extremely accessible. We would love to like, obviously attend more events, but we can only stretch ourselves so thin. But we're very, very, very accessible, and we are devoted 100% of our time is only to games on Kickstarter. And Kickstarter games is roughly 20% of all Kickstarter, which is pretty cool to think about. Like, this really, really huge space who are making an impact, not just on games, but also like we're participating in this sort of ongoing discussion of, are video games art, and is art considered a video game? So it's kind of cool to like continuously participate in just in that space.
Yeah, you can definitely straddle that kind of gap between art and commercial projects there with Kickstarter. So totally. You definitely see that outside games in Kickstarter. People are doing Kickstarter for like public spaces or events, things that just have no commercial kind of return. So yeah, there is space there for really artsy games projects as well.
Yeah, we love those.
So if someone listening now is working on a game and they're interested in Kickstarter and they're not sure if Kickstarter is right for them, how should they kind of figure that out? So personally, I make games as well, and I'm a little scared of Kickstarter. So A, I could put out my project there, it could be a failure. B, I've heard from people that it's an immense amount of work to run a successful Kickstarter, and then to keep your it's amazing then that you make a community. That's the best thing you could hope for. But then you do need to kind of keep them updated as you make your game. And again, a lot of work.
So I think, this whole idea of failure is it's really interesting to me. I don't think if you have a Kickstarter that doesn't fund means that that's necessarily a failure. Right? So there's a lot of components that go into a project. So number one, I think there's a misconception that you can just put your project on a Kickstarter and you'll get a million eyes on it and you'll fund and it's no problem. I think when we were talking about, Kickstarter is about 8 years old. And so in the early days of Kickstarter, I think that made a little bit more sense. Just like $10,000, put it up. There will be a bunch of eyes on my project. I'll probably get some money. Great. Awesome. No problem. Now I think there's a little bit more work involved, and I think that's a good thing because I think that sort of forces not only the community to kind of like hold people a little bit more accountable, but you're also more accountable for your community. So there's a little bit of like preliminary work that needs to go into it. So one, you really want to make sure that you have your idea at least like 90% of the way thought out. That doesn't necessarily mean 90% of the way developed, but you need to kind of know, like, this is my idea, this is what I want to do. And that last 10%, anybody that has ever worked in development or made a game, I think can agree with me that like you're going to see unforeseen changes happen to your project, right? Like this is very common and it's totally normal. So rather than just putting something up and like hoping that the money sort of rolls in. You want to do like at least 6 months of prep work ahead of time. So you want to be building that community. So we use these numbers just because it's the easiest way for me to remember things, because I'm terrible with numbers, and also I like tend to read numbers backwards, which is super fun when I try to tip people here in the US. So let's say that you have sort of budgeted your project and you're like, great, okay, I need $50,000. So you want to take that number and divide it by about $20, which is like roughly the average amount pledged to games. Each game is different. Each project is different. That number can be higher or lower. It genuinely just sort of depends on the project. So if you divide your funding goal by about $20, in this specific case of using $50,000, that means you'll have about 2,500 people that you need to reach that need to pledge $20 each to your project to reach your funding goal. So rather than looking at budget numbers, which can be like super big and super scary and super intimidating, focus on how many people it is that you need to reach. So, okay, who is currently in my community? Do I have a mailing list? If I don't have a mailing list, how can I start that mailing list? Can I put my friends and family in there? What's my social media following? Just in terms of like, do I have Twitter followers, Facebook fans, Facebook friends? Like, how do I start building that community? And then you also want to start thinking about, okay, well, I probably need to start going to some events. When I talk about the events thing, people always get really nervous and they think that I mean like just GDC or just PAX or just, maybe for the board game space, like maybe just Gen Con.
But there's also start locally as well.
Absolutely. And I think also like number one, check to see if you have an IGDA chapter where you live or within like an accessible amount of time for you to get to, even if it's just like once a month attending. Are there any local meetups that are specifically for games or, maybe even specifically like if you're like, great, I really want to make this RPG. Is there an RPG meetup where people just want to like sit around and talk about RPGs over like a pint or something? Is there a cafe? Board game cafes and just gaming cafes are becoming more popular. A lot of them are being kickstarted, which is pretty cool. Are there trivia nights? Trivia nights are actually like kind of a really interesting space because it's sort of that same
crossover space there. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So like get a little creative about how it is that you can start reaching people. And then when you're going to these events, and like don't just go once, you need to go maybe like 2 or 3 times. Start collecting people's emails. There's also a lot of like small cons that kind of are popping up around. So smaller conventions, smaller like gaming events within specific communities. So maybe like the Northeast Regional Game Conference or something like that. Do a little bit of research. And then also like look into who else is making games in your hometown or somewhere near you. You kind of just never know. Games is a very, very large industry in the sense of like, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, but the game development space is actually like, it's surprisingly small.
And friendly. I mean, I think you see that as well. People are always willing to talk to each other and help each other out.
Yeah, I will say like games is very different from a lot of the other sort of like creative spaces that I've been a part of. The competition that I feel as a musician, I don't feel as someone who works in games. Granted, I don't work in game. I'm not a game developer, so I can't necessarily speak to that like 1-to-1 ratio. But
it's definitely what I feel that you don't steal each other's customer or airspace. There's not a limited bandwidth. I mean, it feels much more like everyone wins together when you help each other.
I think Rami Ismail is a great example of someone who is consistently championing other game creators, and he himself is like I think when you think of indie games, you think of Rami.
Sure.
I think he's a really fantastic example of someone who's like, I have a platform to give other people a voice, which is that to me speaks to just the spirit of indie games. So like, don't be afraid to reach out to people. If they don't necessarily get back to you, there's, number one, that's okay. Number two, they're probably not ignoring you. They're just super busy because we're all busy making games and art. And number three, there's other people that you can talk to. So like, don't be scared to reach out to people, but also don't badger people.
Yeah, it's a fine line. I've got a question here from one of our viewers. Retro Neo Games is asking, do Kickstarter feel like the relevance is fading a little with digital games on the platform because of things like press no longer being interested in new Kickstarters, or games receiving less money or failing more often? It seems to me anyway. Is this a misconception, or is it something Kickstarter is concerned with?
That's a really good question. In the short answer is no. So press is sort of an interesting space. I think there's again a misconception that if you get a bunch of press about your project, um,
It'll
you
win, or it'll be
you'll
successful.
you'll be successful. And unfortunately, what we found is that press doesn't translate to pledges. It feels counterintuitive, but if you kind of think about it, like again, when we're talking about sort of like fighting for attention on the internet and space and just eyeballs, when I'm looking at Kotaku or Polygon or whoever, I also have like 15 different tabs open. I also have my phone, and then I have this and I have that. And so I'll read an article about maybe something that's like, oh, this game I should check out, and I'm going to forget about it because I've got a million other things going on. So press is like a good space. If you can get it, that's awesome, and you should definitely like try to get press, but it's not the be all end all of projects. In terms of the digital space going away on Kickstarter, no. We've had a really, really large number of projects that have funded recently, and also a large number of projects that are coming out on Steam. Again, Pinstripe came out this year. I'm not sure when Adventure Pals is launching, but I think that if it's not the end of this year, it might be next year.
Hollow Knight came out recently.
Yeah,
That's
Perception.
another.
There's a really, really large number. Actually, if you go to kickstarter.com/play, that should have all of the games that have been released on Steam, which is pretty cool.
That's cool.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, it's kind of the like challenging part of working at Kickstarter is I'll go to like E3 or GDC and I'm like, that's a Kickstarter project, that's a Kickstarter project, that's a Kickstarter project. But we want to we understand from like, if any of these games are published, like the publisher kind of has their right as the publisher to have their branding on projects. So we don't really like push creators to say like, make sure you let everyone know this was a Kickstarter project. Cause it's just, first of all, it feels weird. And also like, it's just kind of off brand for us. We don't want to push our brand onto people. But if you do a little bit of research, you can see like there's a lot of really, really successful Kickstarters that are coming out right now on Steam. This year alone, we've had a lot of really fun projects fund. We just recently had a $3.2 million video game project fund as an MMO called Ashes of Creation.
Yeah.
There's also there's a video game project right now that their goal is $500,000, and I checked it this morning, and I believe they're at like 51%, called Pathfinder. Pathfinder, I think we all know.
Yep.
But it's definitely
That's
doing.
probably going to blow up. That's only 2 days old, I think, or 1 day. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty new project. There's a lot of projects in the works that are also going to be coming out in the summer and come August, September that are also like pretty big. I would, however, say I think this idea of like everybody makes $1 million on Kickstarter, I think is a little bit more challenging. These things are cyclical. I think also like there's a lot of things happening in the world right now. So I don't know if people pledging millions of dollars to games project versus like maybe giving like a little bit more money to charity. I think that's an interesting thing to kind of think about too, just in terms of like.
It's also, a visibility thing. So it's the exact same thing on Steam with released games, Kickstarted or not. They don't all blow up. Some will, some won't. But there's definitely space there to be successful without being that, that massive hit.
Well, and I think that's a question that you need to ask yourself. Like, am I doing this so I can make $1 million, or am I doing this because I just sort of want my art to be seen by people? Or am I just doing this because it's like weird and fun and I'm just sort of like experimenting? Like, I think you need to go into it sort of thinking about what your end goal is.
You mentioned Kickstarter loving to see, games projects be successful, but you don't always get, direct credit for kind of where it came from. Have you ever thought about, doing like Kickstarter Originals, actually funding projects that are then delivered through the platform? It seems to me that you're really focusing on the platform, and that's great. But, if you look at Netflix, which is also a platform directly funding really excellent TV, there's definitely, it's an untapped space there where someone like Kickstarter or Valve could come in and do, Steam Originals or Kickstarter Originals, game projects that are essentially commissioned.
Well, I think we would then be acting as a publisher, and I think that's something we just sort of aren't interested in. I mean, Kickstarter, like our mission statement is to bring creative projects to life. So we exist to kind of help elevate creative ideas. So I don't think we necessarily want to dive into that space of like being a part of IP creation or even publishing IP. It just doesn't feel super on brand for us.
Cool.
But it is an interesting idea.
There's another question here from Gazapper. Can current Kickstarter campaigns get traction without the need of premium Kickstarter boosting websites? How effective are those booster services like BackerCamp, etc.?
Yeah. So those booster services are
so like paid traffic for your Kickstarter campaign?
Yeah. I think when it comes to a lot of these booster services, like, first of all, I think anytime anybody's saying, I can get you XYZ and promising you the world, you should do your research on them. We don't necessarily, like, recommend one versus the other or any of them. I think sometimes they can help and sometimes they can hurt you. So I think doing your research on any of them is super necessary. I think also the thing to keep in mind is, again, like, your community wants to hear from you. They want to know that you're a part of the process with them. So if you sort of like start ghosting your community and you're like, oh, this person will take care of my press, or like this third party that I know nothing about will send a bunch of tweets on my behalf. People can kind of tell when the creator of a project isn't speaking about the project. So I would just be very cautious about that.
So you mentioned a while ago there, kind of basically setting up grassroots support for your project before you launch it as being really important. Mm-hmm. It also feels to me that people like backing success. So you see a lot of Kickstarter campaigns that are, say, a third or half funded in that first day. And then suddenly everyone will want to take part. It's clear that it's going to be successful and everyone wants to back it then. So, I mean, what's the best way to kind of leverage that first day? So you mentioned grassroots, build up fan base, have them ready to go, family and friends, obviously. There's no secret formula, obviously, but what's kind of the best way to help yourself? I mean, how important is that? Is it important to have as big a start as you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things there. So we've seen projects that we were like, there's no way this is going to fund. The last 72 hours, we're like, there's just no way. And for whatever reason, there's a huge uptick. So there's a little button on Kickstarter. I think it's called Remind Me. And it basically it reminds you it's either the last 72 or 48 hours of like, this project is still, going to happen. And what we have seen with Kickstarter projects is that there's a bit of it's a consistent sort of curve that will do this.
S-shaped.
Yeah, it's kind of does this.
Yeah.
So the first like 72 hours on a project, that is definitely like sort of critical point, and that's where you will see a huge uptick in terms of pledges. And then even if you've like overfunded and you're like, great, I had a goal of $20,000, I have $100,000 now. Everybody still goes through this. It's called a project plateau.
Yeah.
And so the pledges kind of die out essentially.
Like creators start panicking.
And that's when I get anxiety-ridden emails. And I'm like, it's okay. But then the last 72 hours tend to mirror the first 72 hours. So you kind of want to think about things in three chunks. So those first 72 hours is when you want to do like your email blasts, your Twitter blasts, your personal emails to people, your Facebook blasts, like really like let people know about the project. You also want to be thinking about your updates on your Kickstarter, right? So like Kickstarter, you do updates. You want to do an update every 2 days, and we recommend like before you launch, you have roughly like the first half of your updates kind of like thought about. During that project plateau period is when you want to start responding to your community. Any questions that come up, like, hey, are you going to offer multiplayer? Are you going to be available on Switch? What about this? About that, like responding to your community. You also want to think about doing things like live streams. We've seen people do really interesting things with live streams. There was one team who live streamed a party launch where they like threw a party and live streamed it on Twitch up to the minute that they launched. And then they did a couple live streams where they did like some Q&As. Twitch is obviously a great resource
Yeah.
for live streaming. We also have our own live streaming service called Kickstarter Live, which is like by no means anything compared to Twitch. It's a totally different offering. But the cool thing is you can see when people pledge in real time on Kickstarter Live, and it's more of an option for you to kind of do like a Q&A with your community. So you can let people know like 48 hours in advance, hey, we're going to be doing a live stream, maybe like collect like the top 5 to 10 questions, something like that. You can also respond to people in real time in Kickstarter Live. It's really interesting.
And do you guys feature creators on that? On Kickstarter Live, or is it like Twitch where it's really up to the person
like
themselves? Yeah.
Features on Kickstarter are all done through our editorial team. The two people on the games team, we're in constant communication with our editorial team, and so we'll say like, hey, this project is really awesome. Let's see if we can give it a little bit more love. Hey, we really, really believe in this project. Hey, this project deserves, a little bit more attention on the site, or a little bit more attention on social media, or kind of whatever the features are. Also, we rolled out last year something called the Games Newsletter, which is a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks that is curated by Luke and I on the games team.
Cool.
So we'll feature like anywhere from like 4 to 6 video games projects, 4 to 6 tabletop projects. We also are sort of like constantly putting new things in. So we're trying to do like, hey, this project is ending soon. Also like, hey, here's the trailer for a project that was funded that's going to be launching
nice
soon.
Yeah.
Also, hey, this is now available for purchase on Steam. So again, it's a way for us to kind of like, we have our own community of Kickstarter that we want to participate in. So it's a way for us to like elevate creators and also participate within the community itself. But aside from, editorial sort of managing all of that and we providing a lot of context, I definitely encourage people to reach out to me directly so I can work with you on your project so we can make sure that it's in the best shape possible. And then also like I can give you other tips and tricks, ideas, things like that.
Can I ask you what do you think are the absolute worst mistakes you can make if you're a game creator now and you're putting up your Kickstarter? What is the worst thing?
Just having text. So just having like a paragraph of like, this is my game idea.
I've seen a few that say like, I'm going to make a Sonic game, something that it's not going to run, obviously. So I guess have your licenses up front or be original.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're like, I'm going to make the next Mario, like, cool. I mean, you never know, right? Like you genuinely never know. But I think you need to have a little bit of concept art. If you can have GIFs, those are fantastic. Have a video in your project, and do your preliminary work ahead of time. But just putting up like 2 sentences, no video, and saying I need $100,000, like, please don't do that. It makes our lives a little bit difficult, and you're just going to be frustrated with the whole process.
Cool. I want to talk about board games as well. So what do you think the big difference is there? So I feel like people really kind of buy into board games because you get a physical thing.
Yeah.
It feels like you're getting something that you've helped create, much more so than digital games. And every time I look at board game Kickstarters, they seem to be massive and, really great. I also like that if you're doing a print run, there's a minimum, amount of money and copies you need to get done for that to be viable at all, which means Kickstarter like solves a massive problem that isn't really there in digital games. I mean, yes, in both cases you need to develop them, but the kind of minimum purchase to create something physical is kind of guaranteed by having a successful Kickstarter. And if it's unsuccessful, you didn't waste all your money and space in your house. Right. In terms of what else is there? What's different there for board games and video games?
Well, I think the minimum is sort of the key. So I think with board games, you're sort of saying, I know I need this much to literally make something, right? To like send this out to like manufacturing and shipping. With digital, I think the challenge with digital that is like it's the most frustrating thing is that there will always be a delay in development. So you can have the best intention of like, nope, I have a project that's launching today and I know it's going to come out in July 2018. It will not come out in July 2018. The
Pretty
chances of,
rare. Yeah.
I shouldn't say will not. The chances of it coming out in July 2018 are rare. There's always a delay in development. There's always something that happens. And I think that is the most frustrating part with digital games. And it happens. It's extremely common. The other thing is saying, okay, well, I know like this is my budget. And then all of a sudden realizing that you need more budget. Games cost a lot of money to make. Digital games cost just an exorbitant amount of money. So I think being very honest to like not just to your community, but also with yourself of what your budgets need to be, and like sitting down and really budgeting out, and then also thinking of like sort of a contingency plan of like, okay, well, I actually need a little bit more budget. The Kickstarter did extremely well, but I know I just need $20,000 extra dollars. Like, where else can you go for that? What are other options for you to think about to make sure that you make the thing that's super cool? That could be anywhere between maybe like instead of knowing, okay, well, I could probably make this game for $30,000, but if I went to Kickstarter and asked for $50,000, I know I'm going to be much more happier about this. And maybe like I need to do a little bit more outreach ahead of time, but I'm going to be a little bit more secure of when I can come out with this. I think that's a little bit better of an experience than saying like, oh, I'm going to make this for $10,000. I hope it happens. Does that make sense?
Yep. And with physical games, you kind of have, like you mentioned there, the minimum. So if you go and find a printer to make your game, you kind of have a minimum there that you need to reach, which is great. You know, that is your goal then.
Exactly. I think also like I don't want to completely like I don't want people to view publishers as this like evil space. Like there's some really fantastic publishers out there. Armor Games is a great indie publisher. They're relatively hands off in terms of any sort of creative direction. They just believe in games and they want games to be made. Devolver is a great publisher. They're obviously pretty difficult to kind of break that mold. But Devolver's a great publisher. Adult Swim is a great publisher. Armor Games is a great publisher.
There's a whole tier of what I call indie-friendly publishers that are different from the old school publisher style of partnership where they would own everything. Like if they did a deal with Sony.
Exactly. And I think to go back kind of to what we were speaking about with like game creators being extremely friendly with each other, you'll find that with publishers too. Like even if maybe like the team at Armor Games is like, this isn't really for us. Maybe they should try this other publisher. Like I know the Armor guys back in the Flash days, and that was one of the things that we really believed in with each other was that, we were competitors, but we were also friends. And Dan and I would be in contact of like, hey, we can't pick this game up, but we think it's cool. Do you want to do something with this? Or he would do the same thing with us.
That's cool.
And I think that relationship is still built, and that's still very much a big part of a lot of these indie publisher spaces. So like, don't be afraid to reach out to a publisher. It's totally fine. It's okay.
Cool. So I'm not going to keep you much longer, but if our members want to get in touch with you, should they email you or reach out to you on Twitter? Or is there just a Kickstarter email they should kind of fire into?
Yeah, so there's 3 ways to get in touch with us. You can reach out to me on Twitter. That's totally fine. I think you put my Twitter handle on Twitter. My email is Anya. It's Anya @kickstarter.com. Or you can email games@kickstarter.com.
Okay.
I'm more than happy to get in touch with people.
I'll just put that into the channel here.
Oh, cool.
Games@Kickstarter.
Yeah.
That's
if
nice and easy to remember.
If you email me directly, that's probably better. But if you're like, I don't remember her name, it's weird. Games@Kickstarter.com.
Well, if you forget, folks, we put this series up on YouTube as well, so you can go find and watch this again.
Cool.
That's super cool. So if anyone has an idea they're floating, or I'd say preferably a Kickstarter project draft to share with you, is that what you'd like to see?
Yeah, I mean, also, like, if you just have questions, we're happy to answer questions. We're very accessible.
Super. That's really helpful. Cool. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you, Anya, for your time. Thank you so much. Very interesting, and we'll be in touch if we have. Oh, I have one last question snuck in.
Yeah.
Synthesizer says, any advice if you're unsure whether or not to include physical rewards for a digital game campaign on Kickstarter? Which I
That
think
is
is a very good question.
That's a very, very good question. So
Because
we
that's kind of
recommend,
scary.
it's very scary. And so if you are going to be including any physical rewards in your digital game, make sure that you include any shipping costs into your funding goal. So shipping ends up being extremely expensive. There's a couple different ways to do shipping on Kickstarter, but you definitely want to factor any shipping costs into your funding goal, because that definitely has happened in the past where people have offered some really cool physical rewards, and then they didn't realize that the shipping was so expensive to send to people.
Particularly from your own country. So from Ireland, that would be quite prohibitive.
Yeah.
I've heard of people kind of at the bigger end, getting a US partner to help within the US. But if you're small scale, that's going to be hard.
Yeah, there's companies like IndieBox that you can partner with that sometimes will do a bit of a price break and say like, hey, we'll break, and they'll say, hey, we'll cover some of the costs. So don't think that you have to do it by yourself. There are sort of options. So just, again, it's the same thing if you're going to be using like a third-party marketing service. Like, do your research, ask people who've used these services before, and really think about what's the opportunity here? Is it for me to be able to say that like I made a physical thing, or is this just going to be like a huge headache that I don't want to deal with?
At the smaller scale, if you're a first time developer on Kickstarter, would you say maybe stay away from physical rewards, or be very wary at least?
Yeah, I would say be cautious. I mean, if let's say that you reach out to IndieBox or some other service and they're like, yeah, it's super cool, we have these great options, and you're like, I can definitely make this happen. Like, it's a gamble no matter what. But if you feel confident in it, then I think that's really fine. But I would definitely err on the side of caution.
And then in the tabletop space, that's unavoidable. You're backing a physical product. So I guess do your homework there and find out what it's going to cost you, and make sure to factor that into all tiers.
Yeah. And the tabletop space is similar to the digital space. Like, people want to help each other out. They want to see cool things be made. So reach out to, if you know someone that's in the tabletop space and you're like, I'm making a card game, I'm making a miniatures game, whatever it is, reach out to people that you know that are in that space.
Excellent. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Anya Combs. And maybe sometime if you're in Ireland, give us a shout. We'll bring you out to one of our local game community meetups. Be great.
I would love that. That would be amazing.
Brilliant. Thanks, everyone. We'll put this up on YouTube in time. Thanks, Anya.
Thank you so much.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.